As I sit here in my opulent study, surrounded by the finest antiques and the most exquisite artwork, I am reminded of the life I once knew. A life of luxury, where every whim was catered to and every need was met with an iron fist. My name is Amelia Fothergill, and I am a member of one of the oldest and most revered families in Southern aristocracy. My family's history dates back centuries, with roots that stretch from the earliest colonial settlers to the present day. We are the epitome of refinement and elegance, with every detail meticulously curated to reflect our refined sensibilities. From the intricate patterns on our fine linens to the subtle nuances in our art collection, everything is a testament to our dedication to excellence. But beneath the surface of our polished facade lies a world of secrets and lies. A world where the boundaries between reality and madness are constantly blurred. I've lived among these people for so long. I've grown accustomed to the whispers in the shadows, the unspoken threats, and the calculated smiles that hide the true intentions behind them. And then there's Choo Choo Charles, a figure shrouded in mystery, with a presence that commands attention without ever being seen. Some say he's a ghost, others claim he's a genius, but one thing is certain: he's always lurking just out of sight, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. I've heard the rumors about Choo Choo Charles for years, but it wasn't until last night that I truly began to understand the extent of his influence. The invitation to my family's annual ball was unexpected, yet somehow both familiar and thrilling all at once. A sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach as I accepted the invitation, a feeling that only intensified as the night drew closer. As I look around my study now, I am reminded that even in the midst of such opulence, there is always a thread of darkness waiting to be unraveled, and I fear that I may have just stumbled upon it. I woke up to the sound of my personal assistant, Jenkins, knocking gently on my bedroom door. It was 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and I had planned to spend the day lounging by the pool or perhaps taking a leisurely ride through the countryside. But as he entered my room with a discreet smile, I knew that something was amiss. "Good morning, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice low and measured. "I've received an invitation from your mother for the annual ball tonight." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I sat up in bed, my heart racing slightly. The ball was a rare occasion, one that only our closest friends and family were invited to. And yet, here I was, being summoned by my own mother's hand-picked invitation. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins handed me a small, cream-colored card with the Fothergill crest embossed on the seal. The words danced before my eyes. "You are cordially invited to join us for an evening of revelry and merriment at our annual ball. Please arrive by 8 p.m. sharp." I felt a sense of trepidation wash over me as I read the words, a feeling that I couldn't quite explain. It was as if something in the invitation itself was trying to tell me something. But what? I looked up at Jenkins, who seemed oblivious to my unease. "And there's something else, Miss Amelia," he said, his expression serious for once. "Choo Choo Charles will be attending." My heart skipped a beat as I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. How did he know? And what did it mean? As I made my way to the grand foyer, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The air was electric with anticipation, and every guest seemed to be on high alert. And then, just as I was about to enter the ballroom, I saw him. Choo Choo Charles stood at the entrance, resplendent in a tailored black tuxedo that seemed to absorb all light around him. His presence was imposing, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity that sent shivers down my spine. He was surrounded by a retinue of liveried footmen and maids, who seemed to be catering to his every whim without ever breaking eye contact. As he swept into the ballroom, the music paused, and all heads turned to regard him. The room fell silent, except for the soft rustle of silk and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses being raised in a toast. Choo Choo Charles smiled, his lips curling up in a thin, enigmatic smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. And then, with a wave of his hand, he began to move through the crowd, leaving a trail of mesmerized guests in his wake. I watched, transfixed, as he glided across the room, his eyes scanning the sea of faces until they finally came to rest on mine. Our gazes locked, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. It was as if the entire world had narrowed down to just that one point, where Choo Choo Charles and I were the only two people who mattered. As I stood frozen in Choo Choo Charles' gaze, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The room was still, except for the soft hum of conversation and the distant thrum of music. But then, I started to pick up on whispers. Faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to be coming from all around me. They were words, but they didn't make sense. Phrases like "the eyes see more than the mind" and "the silence is deafening." I tried to focus on Choo Choo Charles, but his smile had faltered, and he was now gazing intently at my mother, who stood by the punch bowl, laughing and chatting with a group of guests. My mother's laughter seemed forced, her eyes darting nervously towards Choo Choo Charles before returning to her conversation. I felt a pang of unease as I realized that she was trying to hide something. The whispers seemed to be growing louder, more urgent, but whenever I tried to listen more closely, they stopped. It was as if someone or something was deliberately muffling the sound. I began to feel like I was going mad, trapped in a world where reality and madness were bleeding into each other. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers ceased. The room fell silent once more, except for the distant laughter of my mother's group. Choo Choo Charles turned back towards me, his eyes gleaming with an unnerving intensity. "Shall we dance, Miss Amelia?" he asked, his voice low and husky. I agreed to Choo Choo Charles' request without hesitation. As we made our way to the dining room, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The table was set with fine china and crystal, but there were only 3 places: mine, my mother's, and Choo Choo Charles. My mother seemed nervous, fidgeting with her gloves as she took her seat. "So, Choo Choo Charles, tell us about yourself," I said, trying to break the silence. He smiled again, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "I'm a collector of things, Miss Amelia. Rare and unusual items that don't quite fit into the conventional world." The room fell silent once more, except for the soft clinking of glasses as my mother raised her champagne flute. As we began to eat, I noticed that each course was accompanied by a different guest. There was Mr. Jenkins, a quiet, reserved man who seemed to be studying Choo Choo Charles with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Then there was Lady Victoria, a flamboyant socialite who chattered incessantly about her latest fashion trends. And finally, there was Dr. Lee, a soft-spoken psychologist who seemed to be observing us all with an unnerving interest. The conversation flowed easily at first, but as the night wore on, I began to feel like we were trapped in some sort of twisted game. Choo Choo Charles seemed to be manipulating the conversation, steering it towards darker and more sinister topics. My mother's laughter became increasingly forced, and she began to glance nervously around the table. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but everything seemed to be spinning out of control. As the dinner party wore on, I found myself becoming increasingly entangled in Choo Choo Charles' web of seduction and deceit. He was a master manipulator, using his charm and good looks to draw me in and make me feel like I was the only person who truly mattered. My mother seemed to be playing along, laughing and flirting with him as if she were a schoolgirl again. But I knew better. I saw the desperation behind her eyes, the need for Choo Choo Charles' approval that went beyond mere social niceties. And then there was Mr. Jenkins, who seemed to be watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He would occasionally glance at me during the conversation, his eyes lingering on mine before darting away. I felt like a pawn in some twisted game of seduction and deceit, and I wasn't sure which side Choo Choo Charles was playing on. Lady Victoria seemed to be enjoying herself, flirting shamelessly with Dr. Lee as if they were old friends. But even she couldn't hide the sense of unease that hung over the table like a cloud. As the night wore on, the conversation turned darker and more sinister. Choo Choo Charles began to speak about his collection, revealing that it was not just a hobby, but a way of life. He spoke of the power and control he felt when surrounded by his treasures, and I couldn't help but feel like I was trapped in his web of obsession. My mother seemed to be getting more and more agitated, her laughter becoming increasingly forced. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the dinner party came to an abrupt end. The guests began to excuse themselves, leaving me alone with Choo Choo Charles once again. He smiled at me, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "I think it's time we took a walk, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice low and husky. I felt like I was being pulled into some dark and twisted world, one that I didn't want to enter. But Choo Choo Charles just laughed, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Come on, my dear," he said. "I promise you'll have a wonderful time." As we stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The streets were deserted, except for a lone figure watching us from across the way. Choo Choo Charles didn't seem to notice him, too caught up in his own thoughts as he led me through the winding streets of the old town. We eventually arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, its walls covered in vines and moss. Choo Choo Charles pushed open the creaky door and gestured for me to enter. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve as Choo Choo Charles led me deeper into the warehouse. He stopped at a large wooden crate, adorned with intricate carvings and symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This is where it all began," he said, his voice low and husky. "My collection." As I approached the crate, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something about it seemed off. Choo Choo Charles opened the lid, revealing a trove of strange and exotic artifacts within. There were taxidermied animals, antique medical equipment, and even what appeared to be a human skull. My mother gasped behind me, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own stunned breathing. "What is all this?" she asked, her eyes wide with horror. Choo Choo Charles smiled, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "This is where I found my first treasure," he said, his voice dripping with nostalgia, "and many more after that." As I looked around the warehouse, I began to realize that Choo Choo Charles' collection was not just a hobby, it was a way of life. And I was starting to suspect that he wasn't who he claimed to be. The figure watching us from across the way seemed to reappear in my mind, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was this man, really? And what did he want with me? As I stood there, frozen in shock, Choo Choo Charles began to speak in a low, hypnotic tone. "You see, Miss Amelia, manipulation is an art form," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "It's about understanding the desires and fears of those around you and using them to your advantage." He took a step closer, his voice dripping with sincerity. "I've spent years honing my skills, studying the masters of manipulation, and I must say I'm quite good at it." My mother seemed entranced, her eyes glazed over as she listened to Choo Choo Charles' words, but I was not. I felt a surge of anger and resentment towards him, and I knew that I had to get out of there. "That's enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want to hear it." Choo Choo Charles chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice low and husky. "You see, Miss Amelia, you're very good at playing games. You're a master of manipulation yourself." I felt a sting from his words, and for a moment I was taken aback. But then I remembered the whispers in the dark, the way Choo Choo Charles had been watching me since the beginning. "I'm not playing any games," I said, my voice firm. "I know exactly what's going on here." Choo Choo Charles smiled, his eyes never leaving mine. "We'll see about that," he said, and with a swift movement he grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the crate. I struggled against him, but it was too late. He had already opened the lid, revealing a small, leather-bound book inside. "This is your first lesson in manipulation," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And you're going to love it." As I gazed into the leather-bound book, a chill ran down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, each one more sinister than the last. Choo Choo Charles' eyes seemed to gleam with excitement as he watched me, his voice low and husky. "This is where the real magic happens," he said, his fingers trailing over the page. My mother seemed entranced, her eyes fixed on the book as if she was being hypnotized. But I knew better. I knew that this was just a trick, a way to keep us under his control. Suddenly, the room seemed to spin around me, and I felt myself being pulled into a world of darkness and madness. The symbols on the page began to glow, casting an eerie light over the room. Choo Choo Charles' voice grew louder, more insistent, and I felt myself being drawn into his web of deceit. "Come closer," he said, his hand reaching out for me like a grasping claw. "Let me show you the secrets of the night." I tried to resist, but it was too late. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt myself being consumed by an unseen force. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. Choo Choo Charles stood over me, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "You see, Miss Amelia," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I told you this would be your first lesson in manipulation." My mother was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she had been taken by the same dark force that had consumed me. I stumbled to my feet, determined to escape and find her. But as I looked around the room, I realized that we were not alone. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and writhing like living things. And in the center of it all, Choo Choo Charles sat on his throne-like chair, his eyes fixed on me with an unspeakable hunger. As I stood there, frozen in terror, Choo Choo Charles began to speak in a low, hypnotic tone. His words dripped with malice and seduction, drawing me in like a moth to flame. "You see, Miss Amelia," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement, "there's more to me than meets the eye." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "I have secrets, dear one, secrets that only a select few have ever laid eyes on." I felt a shiver run down my spine as he paused for dramatic effect. "And you, Miss Amelia, are about to uncover them all." The room seemed to spin around me, and I stumbled backwards, desperate to escape the darkness closing in around me. But Choo Choo Charles was relentless. He reached out and grasped my wrist, his touch sending shivers down my spine. "Come closer," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Let me show you the truth." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift and contort like a funhouse mirror reflecting reality. I stumbled through the distorted space, trying to keep up with Choo Choo Charles' words. We moved beneath the surface of the world into a realm where madness reigned supreme. The air was thick with the scent of decay and corruption, and I knew that I was in grave danger. But Choo Choo Charles just laughed, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You'll never escape," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "For once you've seen beneath the surface, there's no going back." And with that, the world went black. As I came to, I found myself back in my own bed. the events of the previous night a distant memory. But the feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of perception. I knew that Choo Choo Charles was still out there, watching me, waiting for his moment to strike. And then, just as I was starting to relax, the doorbell rang. It was my mother, her eyes sunken and pale, her skin deathly white. "Emilia," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. "I've come to take you away." I felt a surge of fear as I realized that something was terribly wrong. My mother had always been there for me, but now she seemed different. Her eyes seemed darker, her smile twisted and cruel. And then, just as we were about to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone was trying to make their presence known. The doorknob turned, and Choo Choo Charles stood before us, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll never take her away from me," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. My mother seemed taken aback, her expression faltering for a moment before she regained control. "We're just trying to protect you, Emilia," she said, her voice dripping with honey. But I knew better. Something was wrong, something that went far beyond mere protection. And then, just as things were about to escalate further, the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't my mother who answered it, but a stranger, someone who seemed to be watching us all with cold, calculating eyes. "Hello," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "I've been looking for you." As the stranger entered the room, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. Who was this person, and what did they want? My mother seemed just as uneasy, her eyes darting back and forth between the stranger and Choo Choo Charles. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension like a string about to snap. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Victor," the stranger replied, his eyes never leaving mine, "and I'm here to put an end to this charade." Choo Choo Charles laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "I have too many secrets, too much power." Victor's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to burn with intensity. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with menace. My mother seemed to shrink back, her eyes fixed on the stranger with a mixture of fear and longing. But I stood tall, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I had to protect her, no matter what it took. Choo Choo Charles sneered at me, but I could see the faintest glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. He was caught off guard, and for a moment I thought I saw my chance. "No," he spat, his face twisting with rage. "You'll never defeat me." And with that, he reached out and grasped my wrist, his grip like a vice. But Victor was too quick. He lunged forward, grabbing Choo Choo Charles' arm and twisting it behind his back. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and final. "You've lost." The room seemed to fade away as I watched Choo Choo Charles stumble backwards, his eyes wide with shock. My mother collapsed to the floor, her body limp and still. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything was over. The darkness receded and the world came back into focus. I stood there, frozen in shock, as Victor turned to me and smiled. "It's done," he said, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe now."